This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
I guess I'm driven by the notion of having a little more lively discussion about some big issues that are driving the world, and I think population is a huge one. So I sent you out a few email questions very late last night, so you know, if some of you didn't get around to it, that's fine, but I hope at least most of you did the reading, and I want to try to you know, kind of get at this question of population. So I mean, let's just have a relatively free-roaming discussion. But what I want to get to are really issues that, to me, are essential. I want to actually teach a course in a couple of years on responsibility. And it seems to me responsibility has a lot of issues about, you know, questions about acts of omissions versus acts of commission. And who's responsible for this environmental problem, you know, and what's the problem of you know, as most of you, will probably at least some point have to think about whether you're going to have a child or not. I want to engage with. So and if you're an American, having a child means using a whole bunch of the world's resources relative to everybody else in the world. What does that mean, and what responsibility do you take on in that? And then, as we think about a world in which there's 10, 12, 15 billion people, and we say that ain't going to work. Those numbers don't compute with carrying capacity of the Earth for a whole bunch of the resources out there. What do we do to get from here to a world that's not like that, right? And I think that choice is going to become much more stark, much harder, and so I'd like to kind of engage that debate. So I think maybe one place to start is to start with. Just what's our internal model about what's driving population? Okay, I mean, one way to think about it is think about this pollution identity, or the kind of environmental impact identity. Environmental impact is equal to what? What determines environmental impact? Well, it's the number of people times the units of consumption per person, right, times the units of environmental impact per unit of consumption, right? So go back to the free trade and environment discussion. To oversimplify, free trade has two effects. One is increases units of consumption per person, right? Costs are lower, so we buy more stuff. Hopefully, competition leads to units, especially if environmental things are internalized in the economic marketplace, right? Then units of environmental impact should be lower per unit of consumption. So each dollar you spend produces more pollution, but you spend more dollars. Okay? So that's the environmental identity, kind of an environmental impact identity, right? Or at least one of them, right? You can just do the math, so all these things cancel out into, right? So then the question is certainly one of the things, and in the Gita Sen article, it is Gita Sen, right? I think so, yeah. In the Gita Sen article, she they talk about these different, and in the other readings you had, talk about these as different sources, right, of or different sources and different solutions, right? But so let's just work this part. So one way to reduce the total human impact on the world is to reduce the number of people. Then we have to say, so what is something like number of people is a function of what? What's it a function of? Well, what the number of people is a function of is dependent on our model of why, what's our internal model of the processes that determine how many children people have. So what are those? What determines in both at an individual and at a collective level how many people there are in the world?
I think a big one is income.
Okay, so we'll lay out a bunch of these. So one is income. How does income work, Sarah?
Well, it's kind of related to education too, but.
Okay. Bait and switch. Get me going on income and then tell me it's education.
The more it's sort of been shown in a lot of places and just like observational stuff from a lot of people, that if the higher your income, the more likely you are to have fewer kids.
Okay, so as income goes up, income increases leads to increase in income leads to decrease in children. Why?
Education, basically.
Well, you get educated that more children is bad? What do you get educated about? Why does education matter?
You get educated about birth control
and
that it would be better to have fewer kids for your own, to retain your income.
Okay, so there's two parts of it. One is it's assuming that kind of objectively it is the case. What wrong person that happened to just now. Inherently, there's two different assumptions going on here, right? One is that having fewer kids is in your interest, right? That either you want to have fewer kids, right? An underlying assumption is that either you want to have fewer, right, but can't, but don't know how, right? That's the first part of your education. Bear with me for a second, then you can correct me. Okay, so, and the other is education clarifies that more kids not in your interest. Okay, so education can work two ways. Again, this is the kind of meat on the bones thing I was picking on Kate about. Is kind of tell this story about not just that increasing income leads to decreased children, but think through what does that mean? Well, it must mean that either you want to have fewer kids already, but you don't know how, so you get educated about birth control, right? Yeah, and because being educated about birth control only matters if I want to do it, right? You can educate me from now till the cows come home. If I want to have more kids, educating me about birth control ain't going to help because I don't want to use it. The other is that it clarifies that I don't want to have more kids. I just didn't realize it. I was too silly or stupid to realize that I didn't want more kids, that more kids is an expensive thing to me or something like that.
Right. But what happens is, if you have a rural farm family there, they want more kids because they want more labor. And even if you're an urban family, you want more kids so they can go make more money and support the whole family. But as family income rises, people sort of think more about how they don't need so many kids because it's expensive and they don't want to subject their kids to labor anyway. And so it's this whole sort of upward mobility thing.
So this different model that Sen talks about, the different model of how parents can think, the kind of intellectual model we have about what children are, right? Are children a source of income, a future stream of income, that we have children in order that they take care of us, not merely in our old age, right? Which we know, at least in America, they will never do anyway, right? Because they'll just put you in a home and not worry about you. But, children as a source of income, or children as a cost that we do because they give us some kind of psychological pleasure and satisfaction, right? So that, so part of it is, it's a function of, let's say, the values attached to kids, right? Okay. Allie, did you have a point on this?
Yeah, but I forgot it.
Okay.
I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Along with social values, like the women's role.
Okay. So, and what do you mean by women's role?
Well, maybe in more developed nations, the women's role, women have gone into the marketplace, so they're choosing to have children later. They're choosing to work first, like men, and then have children later. So there's less, like starting younger and having more kids.
Okay. So,
Less of a demand on seeing a woman in a different role other than birth, other than giving birth.
Okay.
She has.
So an important part is where's the woman in the decision process, right? If it takes two to tango, if one person decides not to tango, all of a sudden nobody's tangoing, right? So that the woman's role and power matters in terms of who's, it's not merely how are we making a decision, but who's making it. And to think that interests and incentives might be different between men and women, right, about this, and that as we empower women, that no might mean no more often. Right? I mean, that's the underlying thing is that if women have a choice in the matter, that they might choose to have fewer children. Right? Again, just like here, we're making some underlying assumptions about, which may or may not be empirically true, right? About, okay, in a lot of these countries that the men are just saying to the women, hey, you're going to have more kids, right? That may be the case, but it may not, right? It's something we'd have to invest. It's not like women don't care about children and therefore don't want any, right? We know that they do, and the question is how many, right? I mean, just like men want kids. It tends, whether we believe in it because of some kind of economic model or some underlying just this drive, right? This drive to, every other species seems to have this drive to propagate species, and we don't have any mental model for them. Right? We have a model that's just, hey, they just do it because that's what they do. And we kind of tend to think that our mental processes have overcome a lot of that, but not necessarily. Kim?
It kind of bothers me that our only assumptions around income and education are kind of based on ignorance. Like she doesn't know how to use birth control, or she doesn't know that it's not good to have kids. I think another big thing that income and education do is they just increase a person's opportunities to do other activities that would lead them to not want to have kids. Okay, so income can create opportunities alternative to kids, right? Yeah. Okay, so maybe explain that a little more. What would? Higher income in a developing country gives you access to the university. Access to university and education gives you access to certain types of jobs. When you have those certain types of jobs, then, you want to boost your career, so you're not going to have kids. Okay. It's kind of the same argument, but it's related to income.
Okay. So one might be that, in fact, if you can provide, one thing of income is that I don't actually have to work, I make enough, because I'm well educated, right? I make enough money that I don't have to worry about getting enough money for me to survive from my children, right? I don't have to, it's not my pooled resources of my family that allow me to survive. I actually have enough kind of excess income that I can provide for others, including my children, right? If only I work. And think about how that's changed over time, right? It used to be that in America you could have a single head of household, right? A male could make enough money to provide for their family, at least. And I don't actually know what the percentages are and how they've changed over time, but at least kind of the sort of overall story is the sense that they used to have single heads of household with just the man worked and he could make enough money to provide for the whole family. Now, in lots of families, you need two parents to make it work, even if there aren't two parents around. That's what you need to survive financially. And then as you create opportunities, you're both, one, making it possible that they don't need to rely on children to provide income, and two, you're also changing what they want to do. Right? You're not only changing what they can do, creating opportunity, but changing what they desire to do. Am I only interested in survival, in just basically making it to the end of my life with enough food in my belly to not starve every day, which a lot of people in the world won't happen for, right? Or is it something that says, no, I want to do an interesting job, right? I mean, to have a job that you're interested in, what a huge luxury that most people in the world don't have. Most people want a job that gets food on the table at least once every 3 days, right? That would be a huge improvement for most people in the world, to have a job that gets food on the table once every 2 or 3 days, and enough for their family. And so they're up against a much different problem. So it can create opportunities that are alternative to children, right? Okay? It's an important distinction. Others, Emily, you had your hand up.
I have my hand up, but in the end, it doesn't really change the number of people. But in order to have the birth rate decline, you have to have the death rate decline. So people know that, you know, if they have 10 children, you know, all 10 of them are going to survive.
Right. If you're playing a probability game, right? If you're living in a poor country and you say you want kids because they provide an income stream, and you know just kind of experientially that all of the people in your community, there's a 50% chance that their kid's going to die, right? Infant mortality rate, and also life expectancy, right? How long is this kid going to produce? And it's not merely infant mortality, but how likely are they going to get killed by a landmine if they live in an area that was war-torn previously, right? How likely are they to be killed by all sorts of things during their productive life, you know, that is economically productive life, during the period at which they provide food for the family. As this declines, right? In America, you say, okay, it's a 99% chance that a child you bear will live to the age of 75 or whatever it is, right? And it's actually getting longer, right? So the death rate, but okay, so one is to say death rate, as death rate goes down, especially for during the most productive years of life. I mean, which again is interesting. I'm just reading a book. Some of you might have read it, called Savages by John Kane, about the Amazon. And, you know, talking about, you know, expected life expectancy for the Huarani are like 50 years, right? You know, that I'm a way old man. I may even be in this culture, but in that culture I'm a really old man, right? And I'm very, you know, I'm kind of the sage of the tribe at 44 years old, right? And to think that we're talking about 70, 80, 90 years old as an expected life. So death rate, so decreasing the death rate of infants and children says, okay, if my likelihood of my child living till he's 30, 40, is 95%, then I can have fewer kids, because rather than if it's a 50% chance they're going to die sometime before the age of 10, then I've got to have 2 for every one for kind of my likelihood of success at surviving as a family, okay? What's the other end of this death rate problem with respect to the problem we're trying to work here, though?
Well, if you increase the death rate, then you don't have a population problem.
What? Yeah, right, exactly. We want, I mean, all things considered, if this goes up, that's a good thing, right? We want everybody kind of just have this little chip that goes off at 30, they just die, right?
No, that's not really a good idea.
The master of understatement.
And part of it is because of all the labor laws. Like AIDS is not, you know, a good solution to our population kind of thing at all. You know, it's loss of labor, which means loss of income, which means loss of production to feed people that are living, and I mean, it's a horrible thing.
It's a horrible thing, but wait, but doesn't it doesn't, I mean, I'm going to push, you know, I'm going to push all this stuff. Doesn't it work this problem, though? Okay, so let's think of, because I want to be a little bit kind of out of hand here, because I think it challenges us to think about where we are today is, I keep having the sense that where we are today is, we're just going off the edge of a cliff, and we haven't stopped ourselves yet, right? But we're already on that. I mean, I think I want to kind of come back to the China stuff, right? And kind of, I think that's a challenging issue, is to think about population policy. Because if we think about why, I mean, one way to think, okay, how many people think that we are going to overpopulate this earth, and that's a problem in terms of capacity? At least most of us do, right? They think that there's just going to be too many damn people, and no matter how much you work these two problems, this problem is going to overwhelm it, right? That you can work these as hard as you want, and you can't work them enough. I mean, you can figure out the math here to figure out how hard you got to work these two to allow this one to go the way it's going, right? So we are going to hit too many people. So and again, I'm just doing this to challenge you to think, wait, AIDS, in fact, right? AIDS may be a way, might be, you could, if you believe in some sort of bit higher power, AIDS is just a way to take care of the problem here, right? It works by killing people. Again, I'm just doing this to challenge people. Killing people takes people out of productive capacity, which means there's less food, which means other people die from starvation because there's no food, right? So we have all these knock-on effects that say for every AIDS person that dies, a bunch of other people die, right? I'm saying we've got an overpopulation problem. So, and I would agree completely, that's not the way we want to solve it, okay? The question is how do we solve it? Okay, so if we're not going to let nature play its course, right, play its hand, and say, because we don't like, I think precisely because we don't like the way AIDS kills people. We don't like AIDS as a way of saying, here's going to be our population control strategy, let AIDS work, right? That's not a good public policy. We don't like it. And I want to come back to that in 10, 15 minutes, is to say, what is a good public policy? How do we think about, what's a good public policy? Because you're saying AIDS is not a good one. Why not? Because you don't like some other set of effects that it has.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Well, and also because it's like, so AIDS is really prevalent in like Africa, especially Southern Africa, and there's some great land there to be like cultivated, and they're doing a lot of agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I mean, if that land is totally taken out of production, and I mean it's currently not being used to the fullest it could be used, I guess.
Right.
Whatever your standards are, and that's bad for like the rest of the world too. And
so there's
people who will live in Africa. I mean, and so it's not really. It's like you'll still have overpopulated other places without food. I don't know.
Okay, so there's one issue about overpopulation where, right, that AIDS rates, certainly AIDS is not a good population control problem because it actually doesn't, it's not, we're just letting nature figure out where it's going to take people out, and we're not doing it self-consciously. But, okay, so you would have all this unproductive land, okay? I want to keep coming back to these because I want to say towards the last 20 minutes, 25 minutes of the class, to say, so what's a good population control policy? We've decided, or Sarah's decided that AIDS is not a good population control policy. Allie.
We're still on functions, right?
Yeah. What are the other ways it works?
Religion, because if you're against contraception, then that's going to be an issue for a population. And also, if you're against abortion, which doesn't have to be a religion issue, it could be more a morality issue. Some people think of that as immoral.
Right.
So you put not immorality, morality.
Right.
Up there.
Okay. Religion, morality. Again, this relates to if we had a kind of super category, if we had a culture in which it says, one could imagine, one might hope, right, that given overpopulation, it'd be nice if there was a morality in America that said, don't have kids, right? Given that our kids are likely to use a lot more resources than almost any other children in the world, right? It'd be nice to have a morality that said, yeah, it's just, it's like drunk driving, don't drive drunk, don't have kids, right? Because having kids is a bad thing for the world. I mean, go back to Garrett Hardin's example. What's driving Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons example? Do you care about cows in England in 1600? What's his major example? People having kids, right? That's the Tragedy of the Commons, that we take individual resources, beneficial to us to take them, with all kinds of externalities on other people, right? So but morality and religion are huge drivers. They are things that are so, even for those of us who are a-religious, there's deep moral feelings, right, that may have been instilled by religious experiences when we were kids, but deep-seated things that we don't question, right? It's not, a lot of this stuff is about costs and benefits of kids. No, it's not. You don't kind of sit down and calculate with your spouse, okay, let's figure out how much we're going to have to spend on child education. We're going to send them to a private school. You don't figure out costs and benefits here, right? You just have kids. And that's for the ones that are planned, right? Forget the ones that aren't planned, right? But for the ones that are planned, you're not planning it. You just say, we want to have kids. Let's have kids. I got a friend who's got 5. I'm thinking, where these things come from, man. let me kind of tell you about the birds and the bees here. There's an educated person who's got 5 kids, in this day and age. And I'm like, wait, it's great for him, but it actually does piss me off. No, this is an American, this American who's got 5 kids, who's taking up 500 times more resources than someone who has 1 kid in Africa. And that should piss you off. They're taking resources. Diana.
I was going to bring up another function that might be on sovereignty issues. I mean, even if it were possible to bring like NGOs or whatever to let's just say Africa, and the government has, issues of sovereignty, you're not going to tell our people how to blah, 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 and disrupt the traditional role of the women, in cultural heritage and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, even if it were possible to get NGOs to go in, which they do try to do and they are denied, to teach women to, promote whatever it is that they promote, then you can't do it because of sovereignty.
Because of national sovereignty. Okay. So the number of people we have is a function of the respect for saying, as much as we don't like it, we're really glad that the Chinese can't tell us how to do population control in this country. Megan.
I think similarly, there's also sort of the cultural relativity argument, in which, we can't really go into, say, an Islamic country and say, this is all wrong. You're doing this, this is a bad idea. Because they're going to say, look, yes, it's our religion, it's also our culture. It's a lot older than yours. Leave us alone.
Okay, so even if you're not a nationalist, you may believe in cultural relativism, right? The notion that we don't have the right to get off and tell other people what to do. And I think an important element in cultural relativism is when you think about issues that are near and dear to your hearts, whatever they might be, whether it's abortion or female genital mutilation or any of these issues where we talk about cultural relativism, think about it the other direction, right? Think about that being a dialogue rather than a monologue. In all those cases, we're going to go in and tell these people about why women shouldn't have to wear chadors in Muslim countries. Think about listening when they say why you should, right? Think about what that means in terms of a dialogue. That's different. Where did, God, last time I checked, God didn't come down and hand us all the right rules, right? And then we can then disperse them to the rest of the world. And yet, Americans tend to think that way, or at least the ugly American, stereotype does. And I think what you want to think about is when you talk about cultural relativism is think about, could I imagine listening rather than just talking? And I think that's a really hard thing to do. To try to listen to what somebody else's values are and to say, we're going to have a dialogue here, not a sermon. Right? But a lot of times Americans are famous for giving sermons about it and even the politically correct, the good people, they're still into sermon mode rather than dialogue mode. Allie.
Freedom's also another issue because like in a place like China, they don't have the freedom to decide how many kids they want to have. The government decides for them. But you can't really use it like as a function sort of thing where more freedom equals more kids. It's an individualistic, governmental.
Okay. So freedom certainly, it's something that constrains our ability to constrain the number of people. Is some sense of that people should have choices, that we care about that as much, if not more, than overpopulating, right? It might even be, we're probably getting them confused here, but there's a little bit of a trade-off between some of these things, between, that these are not so much things that people are a function of, but things that we also want to respect in the process of regulating the number of people.
And there's a cultural norm to sustain your culture as well. Like in Italy, isn't the birth rate or population rate, I can't remember which, it's going down, but everyone in the world sort of sees it as like, wait, why are you, there's going to not be any more Italians. And of course the Italians don't see that as a positive thing either.
And I don't know, I'm not positive about Italians. I do know the French have a natalist policy, that they've got a negative growth rate for French nationals. Obviously, this gets back, nationalism works in 2 ways here. One is you want to have French, and 2, Moroccans don't count, right? That is, Africans who come from Francophone Africa. In the French view, they don't count as French, right? And so they want to make sure there's white French being born, and they want to correct that. So you have actually a policy, as opposed to Thailand, where you've got a really great example of a developing country that's actually got a good population control policy, and they've actually worked the problem, and they've gotten their growth rate to decline significantly, despite not dealing with this one, right? So one of the things this is a function of is policy, right? Is state policy, and they've done that successfully. In France, you've got a policy that kind of is urging people to have kids, urging white French nationals to have kids. Megan.
Well, the interesting thing about that, though, is that Eastern and Central Europe actually has a negative growth rate in excess of Western Europe. Like, Western Europe has basically a flat growth rate. Eastern Europe is negative.
Okay.
And maybe I...
Do they have natalist policies?
I haven't seen any.
Okay. Right. I don't think they're worrying about other issues right now. Okay. But certainly this in the sense of that we want more checks in the world rather than thinking globally about how many people are in the world and who cares where they're born, right? You know, they don't have to be Czechs or Slovaks or Hungarians or French or Italian or Ghanaian or, Colombian or whatever, that we're worried about the total population. Yeah.
My policy comment would be, if you look at the big picture, the growth rates, like in developed countries, are very low or negative compared to developing countries. And I think rather than implement policy like in China, there's some examples of, violated human rights in implementing this policy, and it's kind of weird to say, to put such a limit on personal whatever. And we don't have one in the United States, and our population growth is fine. I think that the root of it is like income growth overall. Okay. So I think that policies that promote income growth in other countries rather than, and it goes back to not going in and telling people what to do, but rather just if their incomes rise, then they'll have more incentive to provide for their own and to figure it out. And if that means have 5 kids, then...
But then weren't you saying that Thailand didn't necessarily address the income problem?
Well, they haven't successfully. No, they're not a developed country.
But they have policy. Right, but that's not necessarily going to work. Maybe, they have a really, I don't know, Thailand's policy, but this is not...
It's not fairly... It fits with Western notions of what's an appropriate... It fits more with Western notions of what's appropriate policy than China's fits with Western's notion of what's an appropriate policy. So that it's held up, and I don't know it in detail, but it's held up as an example of the way to do it, right, as opposed to China's, which is not. So, Kari, what were you...
No, I think that stands as a challenge to the fact, the necessity of income coming up.
Okay, right. So one is to say, the problem with something like Sarah's policy is, we don't have incentives to work that problem, right? The developing world has been asking for us to help them with income growth for several decades now, and we've said no, basically, in terms of any significant assistance, right? In terms of look at economic aid to these countries, it's minimal, right? Half of American aid goes to what country? What 2 countries? Israel and Egypt. Half of all American aid goes to Israel and Egypt. And the vast bulk of that to Israel. So to say, okay, so we're not, so one is, if we could do that, that would be great. This is, if we had eggs, we could have ham and eggs if we only had ham, right? This notion of if we had enough aid, we could solve this problem if we only had enough aid, right? So these are sort of a set of things we need to think about. So now I want to go to the other hard part. It's fun to talk about all these things that are functions. Now, let's make some choices. Okay, so what kind of policies? So what kind of policies do we want to think about? And I want to try to give you at least it's not a course on policy, it's on politics, but I think it's important it's something I care a lot about, which is how do we see the world as it is, we think it sucks, we say how do we do something to make it better. Let's think through what we think about how to make it better. So think about things like, okay, first of all, and I think there's one way to think about policies in a range of things, and I want to kind of push it. But one is something we've talked a lot about in the class is effectiveness, right? That is, did it achieve, sort of, let's see, how am I thinking about this? Okay, does it do what it's supposed to do, and does it do it the way it's supposed to do it? Okay, so obtain objectives in expected ways. Okay, so the first thing is this question of effectiveness. This is where causal analysis matters. Did it work? Okay. The second is, Did it work at achieving what our goal was? The second are effects, which is different than effectiveness. Okay? Effects which are unintended but predictable. There's unintended but predictable effects. Okay, so things like, the costs of something, right? The costs are usually a predictable, but unintended. That is, when one implements a policy, one doesn't intend in the sense is one would prefer to avoid incurring the cost of that policy, just have the policy at no cost. That would be a good thing. But it's predictable. Costs, and then hazards and risks, right? So, for example, take any drug that's approved by the FDA, right? That we know it has some level of risk, that they're not risk-free. We have a lot of laws that say we want no-risk drugs, but we know that those aren't biologically possible. You can't have a drug that doesn't have any side effects or any risk. So there's some, and they may only occur in some fraction of the people, right? In fact, there's a nice piece in the New York Times today about a guy who was ex-deputy director of the FDA, talking about a drug that there was some disease where you had basically 3 years to live, and it was a pretty awful 3 years of life, at that point. A drug, live shorter, okay, live about a year and a half, but have a much better quality of life during that year and a half. Should they approve that drug? Right? And how do you make those choices, and how is it, And they're putting thalidomide back on the market, right? Thalidomide back on the market as an AIDS drug, I think. Okay, thalidomide, the source of all sorts of infant deformities, right? 30, 40 years ago. Major problem if it's taken by pregnant women, but not if it's not taken, by men or women who aren't pregnant, it's fine for. It was taken, thalidomide was a morning after drug. Not morning after, morning sickness drug, I think, at the time. So I think it's being used in AIDS stuff now. But in any event, putting back on the market for another reason, the question is that how do we account for those risks? Kim?
Also unintended social consequences.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Like in the case of China, because they only allow you to have one child, and because men are valued more than women, that female children, babies are often abandoned.
Very good. So one is, if you look at a culture, whether it's Chinese or other, where males are valued more than women, and which may not be, go back to our earlier discussion of people, of why you have kids, right? May not be a strictly sexist thing. In fact, men are, on average, a little bit stronger physically, not by a huge amount. So if you want to have a kid who can produce in the fields, right? that 3, 4, 5% stronger boy on average than a girl. Before they're born, you don't know which they are. Which would you rather have? You have a boy who can work in the field, either because of physical things or because of cultural things, because girls aren't allowed to work in the field. There's going to be a selection process that leads to, wow, it just turns out that our rate of boys being born is higher than girls. That's a pretty predictable effect, but maybe not intended, at least from a policymaker's point of view, right? So you'd want to think about what those unintended. There's also, though, some unpredictable. Okay, unpredictable effects, things you just don't expect. Things just blow up. Go back to the Sudan case and CARE, right? You make war worse rather than making it better. And in environmental stuff, or anything as complex as trying to affect why people have kids, expect this unpredictable effects to be quite huge, right? And what's the great thing about them? They're so attenuated, and they're so out far in the future, it'll be hard to tell what caused them, right? You'll just kind of 50 years from now see a bunch of effects that are probably due to this policy, and you can't tell, and you're not sure, and maybe it was something else. So you'll screw things up, but luckily nobody can blame you because it's so attenuated causally that nobody could tell that it was your fault. Okay, that's the plus side of this equation, right? Okay, so you have effectiveness, effects. Another important thing, and I want to kind of really engage this question, means, okay, that we probably care about how it gets done, not merely what the effects and effectiveness are, right? But there's certain things that even if they got the right outcome, We don't like I mean, we talked about freedom here. We talked about religion. We probably don't, we didn't talk about it, but freedom of religion, right? Notion that we probably want to allow people to have their own choices and their own religious beliefs and to be able to act on them, and therefore means may matter, right? What's the problem with forced sterilization? The forced part, right? The sterilization part's okay. Also, just a little kind of vignette, these things about, when you look for, any of you use Alta Vista on the web? I typed in China and sterilization because I wanted to find some stuff. And then down at the bottom of the Alta Vista page where it gives you the results is shop for China sterilization on the web. I'm thinking, no, I actually, and I put in nuclear weapons. You could shop for nuclear weapons on the web too. It gives you this kind of set of, it's their standard little bottom thing, but it's shop for China sterilization, kind of throws you off in the middle of your business day. So we care about means, about how it's done, not just what it's, we're not just people who are consequentialists. We don't only care about the effects, right? And we certainly don't only care about and I think the other is, and this is, I don't know, maybe not the another part of it, but when you think about policies, what's the responsibility for doing nothing? Who takes responsibility if you don't make a policy change? You? If you could have made a policy change and you didn't, who takes responsibility for the fact that we decided not to have a forced sterilization policy in this country this year? Who takes responsibility for whatever the consequences of that are? Where does that responsibility lie? And I think that's a hard question to engage. So let's take the last 15 minutes to just look at this, this quote I sent out. I'll read it to those who didn't get it. And I realize this is touchy areas. And what I want to engage is this question about thinking about it hard. Not just being comfortable with your preconceived notions about how we should address Chinese policy, but let's use them as a case of what at this point in time might seem like an extreme policy, or some parts of it might seem like an extreme policy, and think about kind of why we place it where we place it in whatever our normative sense of is this a good policy or not is. And I think you want to engage this question of why do you think it's a good policy or a bad policy? What different parts of the policy, even in this short quote I gave you. Okay, so it says this is out of a congressional testimony from Christopher Smith, who I think is from New Jersey, just about 3 years ago. We already knew many of the gruesome details of the People's Republics of China's coercive population control program. We knew, for instance, that the government routinely imposes exorbitant fines on couples who had unauthorized children, sometimes amounting to 3 or 4 times the average income of the average Chinese citizen, and that they destroyed their homes and confiscated their personal property when they cannot pay. We knew that when a woman has an unauthorized pregnancy, she is typically brought to the family planning center and subjected to intense psychological pressure, often with the personal involvement of her boss and other people who will power over her until she agrees to the abortion. We knew that when the psychological pressure does not work, women are sometimes dragged physically to abortion mills, and that physical force is often also employed against both men and women when they refuse to be sterilized. Good policy? Bad policy? What do people... Let's lay out what are some of the policies. Let's lay it out in at least for starters, what I'd see as 3 policies. Fines. You get fined for having too many kids. Okay? Right. That was the first level, right? It says something. Emily, you're looking quizzical. So, we knew, for instance, that the government routinely imposed exorbitant fines on couples who had unauthorized kids. Second is pressure. What?
You're laying out China's policy.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Yeah. Pressure, and then coercion. Let's just say that those are there seem to be 3 levels at which they're walking through what happens if you have an unauthorized pregnancy. Okay? Kim?
Do you have any idea about how common these occurrences were?
No, I don't. Be worth knowing. But let's say prospectively, regardless of whether China had these policies or not, right? Let's imagine we want, I think it's interesting, and not to pick on Sarah, but Sarah said, our birth rate's okay in America. You sort of said in passing, well, our birth rate's, we got it right.
Much lower than Africa.
Right, okay. But in any event, certainly a lot of people don't think about our birth rate being a problem in the United States, okay? And the question is, let's imagine, I mean, I don't know, it seems to me even if we've got a positive birth rate in this country, it's probably a bad thing, okay, in terms of the world, because of the amount of resources that 1% sops up in the world is huge. It's just so disproportional. So that we sort of have a responsibility to deal with that. So let's imagine it in terms of these sorts of things. Kari.
There's two sort of things that sort of jump out immediately. First of all, they seem to address things a little bit too late. Like it seems like you should sort of get to people before you have to impose fines for having too many, or like already having had too many kids. Second of all, it seems like they're all very negative things.
Okay.
Isn't there some way to impose?
So let's get some other options on the table.
Tax benefits for couples that aren't having children.
Okay, so tax benefits. Okay, and right now they work the wrong way, right? I believe there are tax benefits to having children. They're called deductions, right? So once again, we discourage work, right? Income tax. We encourage people to have kids. Okay, this is using the tax code in a proper direction here, right? You know, we use taxes to put in roads into the forest to help clear cut, you know, good things like that, like in the tax code. Sarah?
I just want to offer like a counter argument to the consumption thing.
Okay, let's get some more. Let's get some more policies. Okay. First, what are some other policies? Let's imagine we wanted to solve. We couldn't control.
Much younger level.
Okay, education. Alex.
I have more of a perception argument.
Go with it.
I think that the American perception is that these measures are deemed ineffective because they're very coercive and bad. But the thing is,
deemed ineffective? Let's just use our terms carefully. No, we don't like them. They may work. Okay, so it's not ineffective. I mean, we may not like it as a policy, and that's something I think that's important. That's what I think is nice about this example. Because it's not about effectiveness.
We think they're ineffective and we don't like them.
No, we don't like it. I'm just picking on words. We don't like them. There's not a single word, and I bet you couldn't find a single word in this whole congressional testimony about what happened to the birth rate in China. Not ineffective in the sense that we've been using the term in this course. We don't like it. Bad policy. Agree 100% there. But it's not a bad policy because it doesn't work. It's a bad policy because of something down here about means. We don't like the way they do it because we're a free country and we don't like people telling people what to do. I mean, you know, that's kind of in quotes there. But
I guess my point is that we don't like them. Okay.
Yeah.
So what we have to remember is that China comes from, you know, their communist roots, and therefore the government and their state makes decisions for their people, as opposed to America and other developed countries, which have democracies and individuals make their own decisions primarily. So I think that's some of my perception argument of why you have to think about more of the political motivation for these policies.
Okay, but okay. Fair enough. But then what I want to do is use this as a way, though, to kind of use the China place as a stepping off stone for, imagine we wanted, I mean, I'm going to not engage your question about whether we want to have whether allowing American population growth to continue as it is or not, and engaging in the debate about whether that's a good thing or not. I tried it in this. I hope a lot of you walk out of here not really knowing what my belief system is, because I want to encourage to take a devil's advocate position to push people, because I think the most important thing you can do is think hard about things. And that means being open-minded about things that if you really believed them, you should shoot yourself. But to believe, but if you can believe them for a while and engage what it means to believe them, that's an important learning experience. To think it through, what would it mean to say nobody should have kids in America? To think that through and think it through. Why do I balk at that? What troubles me? So to do what Alex just did, which is what troubles me about the Chinese policy, and what's okay about it, what or not, as the case may be. Allie.
Another thing on that list.
Policy.
Yeah, would be to decrease infant mortality, which is counterintuitive because you think less kids dying would have been better. But wait, never mind.
Okay.
But yes.
Okay. So, I mean, we could go back to this list we had of the things that it's functions of and which one works. I mean, so we can have a lot of them. I mean, things like health, right? Improving health, improving education, improving justice and equity, right? Things about just making the world fairer, and so how does that work, Emily? If we increase equity, and maybe we'll put that together with something like about political empowerment, and I don't think they're the same, but How does...
Yeah, I was going to say increase equity in terms of gender roles in countries, but we already talked about it.
But we want to kind of alter gender roles, okay? Empower women, etc. Right? I mean, these are things, you know, that we want to encourage. Kari?
Create benefits for adoption or incentives to adopt.
Okay. Sarah?
I wanted to say, try going back to the equity issue. Like, we have enough food to feed the world and everything, but there's like 1.3 billion people that are hungry, and so it's like even our production can increase with the population and everything, like land capacity and food and stuff. But if we increase like the gap, not between gender, but between like rich and poor, then everything will be like distributed better and
decrease the gap between rich and poor,
yeah.
right? Okay, yeah. So one would be, if we can...
I would like increase income.
Okay. Well, one is if people are having kids because they want to feed their families, if we said, hey, if we could do a food distribution system in which all the excess food we have in the world doesn't rot in silos at different places around the world, but has actually got out to the people who need it, and that there was a way to make sure that, hey, if you want to have food security, you don't have to have kids. Just, you know, call some phone number and somebody will do an airdrop with a helicopter. You know, you get a weekly airdrop. If you live in a poor country, you get a weekly airdrop of food. You distribute food that way. Again, you've taken care of one of the pathways, one of the things that we think drives people's decision to have kids, that they need to have income security during their life because they need food security, so you take care of that in some other way. Diana.
I was wondering how, it's kind of a future argument, but I'm wondering how many people have thought about what the likelihood for, I'm not going to say China-like measures, but something along that nature happening in the future when we get to the point where we have to make some of these drastic decisions because we haven't been able to convince people to, you know, voluntarily sterilize themselves, etc. I mean, I used the argument earlier, this actually at the very beginning, about you know, you can't trust regimes because the next thing they decide is to put, you know, birth control measures into the water where everyone takes it voluntarily. But I mean, that's a little drastic, but I think that something like that might possibly be the only answer we have left to us if we can't do it now.
Okay. So I think that's an important question. I mean, maybe to motivate this, to think about, okay, so what if we don't have it? What happens to populate? What's our prediction about if we don't have some conscious policy of trying to control the globe's population, right, internationally? Here is our, you know, and I don't know what it is, but I think it's probably looks something like this, right? World population. What's our prediction about this? Line just keeps going like that forever? No?
It's going to go up a little bit and start to stabilize, probably.
Boy, you are an optimist. Just stabilize?
But it's not going to go up exponentially like you have.
Okay, it's not going to go up. We could probably say that, or it might, at some point, I mean, if we're lucky, it might approach asymptotically the carrying capacity of the world, right? That we could imagine, I guess, well, I don't know how you, oh, well, yeah, okay, so this is, it would slow down and approach asymptotic. You know, a nice, stable, linear, or at least quadratic equation kind of system in which we just kind of ease up to the population barrier, you know, the carrying capacity of the world. We distribute all the world's food resources equitably across all people. The world is in harmony, right? We zen bliss out and enjoy the world at a perfect level of carrying capacity and number of people, right? That's option A. Option B. Sarah.
Happening now. I mean, it's the same thing in a way. Like a big majority of the world just don't have enough food. They don't have enough resources.
Okay.
Like the same thing. And also, there's like the counter argument that there isn't really a population problem. I mean, in the sense that like Ehrlich wrote that book. Like they said, you know, I don't know exactly what they said, but maybe by the year 2000, you know, we're gonna have a major problem because of the population, and it hasn't really come out that way.
Okay.
I mean, in the sense of like we're fine, but
right.
there's been certain, like I guess the Green Revolution or something, like where they found more ways to feed more people that were starving, but there's still so many people starving.
Okay.
And it's a big problem, but it's just like the rich will stay rich and the poor will get poorer and maybe more. So it's like as population goes up, it's not going to be so much that we're going to need to sterilize population. It's just there's going to be starving people.
Okay, good. So one of the ways to solve the population problem is continue our current policy of dealing with population control. Let them starve to death. That's option B, right? Okay, option B. Option A is we redistribute everything equally and solve it that way. Option B is do what we're doing. It'll take care of itself. Some people will starve. You know, and if they're too stupid to make enough money to keep living, then get rid of those genes from the gene pool. Only let the rich people live. Right? I mean, I'm just saying what I want to engage is this question of responsibility for doing nothing. This question of, wait, people are going to die. It's not like people aren't going to die.
It's not because, what I want to say though, is not necessarily because of the population, it's because of...
Right, because of all these other ways in which we're doing nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Well, I really want to engage this question. Right. But who takes responsibility? Whose fault is that? Is that Henke's fault that we're not engaged in that problem? Is it Ashley's fault? Is it my fault? I mean, I think one of the interesting issues here is who takes the responsibility for things that happen because we don't make choices. So if we've got two choices, we can either choose to, and I want to push this because I want to push people thinking about it, okay? And I know it engages really heartfelt values and stuff like that. So I would just want to push it to think about it. But to think about this question of, okay, current policy. Sarah, what's your best guess of how, if we just go with current policy and we don't fix it, how many people will die from starvation due to our inability to solve the equitable distribution of food problem?
How many people will die when?
Whatever you want, however you, but certain billions, right? Yeah, okay. We'll call that 2B, right? So the question is strictly on an instrumental basis, if we know that the world, the economic, political, social structure of the world is such that that ain't going to happen, we aren't going to properly and equitably distribute food, that's a harder problem to solve, no matter how hard solving population is, if we can do something that, can we find a policy that gets us to a stable world population that kills fewer people than that, do we like that policy? And if we can get a policy that gets us there with with sort of, so this says 2 billion people die and we have a world population of 14 billion in 2050 or whatever the number is, right? Or we can have some other policy where perhaps even at the extreme we sterilize enough people, right? I want to push it at the extreme. We sterilize 2 billion and, or we give them tax incentives or any of these other ways, right? Whatever it is. Can you imagine a world, I think it goes to Diana's question, which is imagine a world where we have to make this choice. Imagine a world where you have to make this choice about how do you do it. In other words, do you do it consciously or do you just kind of let the world work and have the unintended but predictable effects, right? The unintended but predictable effect of not having a population policy and not having an equitable distribution of food policy is this. That's the unintended but predictable effect of not addressing the equitable distribution of food problem in the world, right? We know we could figure out what the numbers are to figure out how many people will die because we don't decide how to distribute food properly. We don't, I would like to do a whole course on this kind of question of responsibility and how do we pick among these. But I think about, one, the first question you want to ask is, if we put tax benefits in, how many people does it lead to have to not have a kid, right? If we impose fines. When I read the China thing, I'm so, I have this little notion in my head about forced sterilization, which was more like the bottom part of this, taking people kicking and screaming and imposing abortions on them. But I don't know, I'm not too hard over on saying, hey, give people strong incentives not to have kids. Why not fine people for having kids? We don't want them to have kids. We fine people for all kinds of other things we don't like them to do. If they want to pay the fine, if you want to turn it into a tax cost, right, that you pay you pay $50,000 for every kid you want to do to the government. That's just kind of trying to internalize an externality, right? Get people, if you're going to pose $50,000 worth of costs on the rest of the world by having a kid, another kid, do it. But you got to pay $50,000 or $500,000 or $5 million to the government to do so. Gets into problems about equity, about do only rich people, okay, but
People that tend to be the people that wouldn't have access to healthcare or preventative medicine or contraception, and then they're the ones that get charged for having a kid. So that's bad.
So the point I want to make here is you want to look through all of these and compare across our policies. The point here is that doing nothing counts. Not having a policy, you got to take responsibility for that too. You know, and that just if we do nothing, our hands are clean. No, if you do nothing, your hands are dirty too. And all we're choosing about is how dirty our hands are going to be here, because we have to take responsibility for what our policies are. And one set of policies is continuation of the current policies, right? And then compare continuation of current policies to any new policies and say, which do I like better? And it's not going to be a nice, clean option where your hands are clean and you say it solves all the problems. It would be great if improving women's roles in the world came with, also took care of the population problem. We might have to make trade-offs. It might mean if you improve women's roles in the world, population goes up. Do we want to improve women's roles and then deal with the population going up from some other way? All good things don't come together, and I think you want to kind of engage that problem. Okay, we're well over time.